Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we have a couple more people filtering in, but what a great turnout for a Friday afternoon. My name's Jamie Ritter. I'm the state librarian and archivist. And I welcome all of you here today. It's great to have you come for Mark's talk. We're very excited to hear this particular topic. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. We installed a new exhibit here, Dear Governor. And so it's on past correspondence from former governors, and it's really interesting to dive into it and kind of take moments in time where we've seen history being created and then seen some of the correspondence from our governors around those significant periods of time. So take an opportunity to look at that if you haven't already. Also, I encourage you to get a library card. They're free. You can sign up right at the desk out front. It gets you up into our research and reading room, where you can access all the wonderful things in our collection. Also gets you into the parking garage, which isn't so bad. So this event would not be possible without the dedicated service and effort that our public services director puts into this, Gordon Belt. Gordon oversees all of our author talks throughout the year. He also oversees our History Day event that we have in October. And this year we're going to have Tanea Kuntz come up and talk about genealogy and some different subjects. So we're really excited about that. But Gordon, I appreciate the work that you do. If you'd like to come up and introduce our speaker today, it'd be great. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for that, those generous remarks. It's always an honor to introduce our Author Talk speakers, and especially today. I've known Mark for more than a decade at least. Started following Mark on social media. Was really engaged with the time period that he was researching and his scholarship, and ultimately met him in person and struck up a good friendship, and have long admired his work, and particularly his interest in having the archives inform research. He regularly brings students into the library and archives, and so that they can learn how these records are so important, and preserving them and making them available to the public is equally as important as well. So thank you for being here. So I want to give you a good introduction. So I want to say Mark is a professor of history at Cumberland University, where he also serves as project director for the papers of Martin Van Buren. He's the author or editor of 9 books, including the award-winning book Andrew Jackson Southerner and The Coming of Democracy, Presidential Campaigning in the Age of Jackson. His most recent publication here is Who is James Polk? The Presidential Election of 1844, which was a finalist for the 2023 Tennessee History Book Award. So I'm honored to welcome Mark to the Library and Archives to talk about the ruptured relationship between James K. Polk and Martin Van Buren. So please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Gordon. And thank you, TSLA, for having me. And thank you all for coming out. As I was driving in through traffic, I had a lot of time to think. And I was like, this is Memorial Day weekend. I might have 5 people here. So the fact that I have more than 5 is very welcoming. So whether you're coming here before you head to the lake, or you're coming here to escape the cicadas, I appreciate your time. I'm going to confess that this is sort of a new talk for me, so you're guinea pigs a bit. So hopefully it goes smoothly. I am going to be talking about a relationship between a Tennessean, a Southern Democrat by the name of James K. Polk, whom many of you are probably familiar with, and a Northern Democrat from New York by the name of Martin Van Buren, whose name you probably recognize, but you may not know as much about. I'm going to talk about the beginnings of their relationship, talk about some opportunities that they had to form a very formidable partnership that would have potentially benefited the Democratic Party, and then talk about how that relationship fell apart over the course of a presidential campaign, the campaign of 1844. So that's our pathway today, and hopefully we navigate it successfully. So I'm going to acquaint you with both men. I don't want to presume that you know anything about either one, so I won't go too in depth, but I want to give you a little bit of context for both men. So Martin Van Buren, as I said, was from New York. He was born in Kinderhook in 1782, entered law, worked his way up in New York state politics, eventually was appointed to the United States Senate. In 1821, he would serve there until the end of 1828. During that time, Van Buren was instrumental, and I would argue the architect of forming the national coalition that formed the Democratic Party. In 1827, Van Buren wrote a very famous letter to a newspaper editor in Richmond, a guy by the name of Thomas Ritchie, in which Van Buren laid out the idea of a national party that would merge Northerners and Southerners. And the reason for this was that Van Buren wanted to tamp down the sectionalism that was being caused by the issue of slavery. And so this idea really forms the basis for the Democratic Party. Van Buren is in New York. He pulls in Thomas Ritchie, the recipient of that letter in Richmond, Virginia, pulls in John C. Calhoun from South Carolina, and then also, and most famously, pulls in Andrew Jackson from Tennessee. And so Jackson is sort of the face of this new coalition, but Van Buren is really the architect behind the scenes, putting the coalition together and helping Jackson to win the presidential election of 1828. As a reward for that, Jackson approaches Van Buren about joining his cabinet, but there's a little bit of an issue. Van Buren had gone from the Senate into the governorship of New York, starting on January 1st of 1829. Jackson's presidency started in March of 29. So Van Buren had a choice to make. Did he give up something he had been working for decades, really, to become governor of his home state? Or did he go national and join the Jackson administration? Well, as you can tell, Van Buren chose to become part of Jackson's cabinet as his Secretary of State. He would spend 2 years in that role. He would leave, he would resign because of a sex scandal, not his own, not Jackson's, but because of another cabinet member, John Eaton, a Tennessean, and his wife, Margaret. There were some rumors about Margaret, and there was a lot of controversy about her and previous relationships, and even her relationship with John Eaton before they were married. And so to kind of get rid of that controversy, Eaton and Van Buren both agreed to resign, which allowed Jackson to reconstitute his cabinet. So Van Buren leaves the cabinet, gives up something that he had not worked very hard for, had been really presented, but something that he had probably aspired to at some point. But as a reward for his loyalty, Jackson appointed Van Buren to be minister to England. So Van Buren heads over to London. He's in London when he receives word that the Senate had not confirmed his appointment. So he has to turn around, and in those days, you don't just jump on a plane, right? He has to turn around slowly, get on a boat, and come back to the United States in the spring of 32. As he does so, however, things are already in the works for Van Buren to become Jackson's running mate in 1832. That ticket is successful, and so Van Buren will spend Jackson's second term as his vice president. So starting in the Senate, making his way to the vice presidency, not a bad run for Van Buren. James K. Polk, with whom you may be more familiar, born in North Carolina, his family moved to Middle Tennessee early on. Polk will go back to North Carolina, to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and then will eventually move back to the Nashville area. Will study law under Felix Grundy, a very famous Tennessee lawyer. Will eventually make his way into the Tennessee General Assembly, and then will be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. In the U.S. House, Polk is a very staunch ally of Jackson, working on his agenda while Jackson's president. He eventually is able to win the speakership of the U.S. House, which of course we all know is a very powerful position, and he will hold that position from 1835 until 1839. When he resigns from Congress, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So these two men, Van Buren and Polk, are both Jackson supporters, very loyal Jackson allies, working in different parts of the government in order to ensure that the Democratic Party's agenda is being executed in the executive branch and in the legislative branch. They do not seem to have had a close relationship, Van Buren and Polk. This is based on correspondence, which is all that we have. They didn't have Twitter or X, whatever it's called now, Instagram, Facebook, and that sort of thing. So we only can go on the correspondence at this point. They do not seem to have had a close relationship. Part of that may have been because some of Polk's friends wrote him about Van Buren and said to him, you need to be careful because Van Buren is someone who only looks out for his own self-interest. Van Buren had several nicknames during this era. He was called the Little Magician. He was called the Sly Fox of Kinderhook, both of which were allusions to the fact that Van Buren worked in the background, worked behind the scenes, not just for the betterment of the Democratic Party, but according to his critics, for the betterment of his own political ambitions. And so when Polk's friends are writing him and telling him to be careful of the Little Magician, that's what they're alluding to. They're saying be careful because if you get caught up with him, he may wind up manipulating you and using you for his own benefit, and you may suffer from that. And so this image is sort of a depiction of how a lot of critics viewed Van Buren, that he essentially was being carried by Jackson, and Van Buren was happily being carried by Jackson in order to further his own ambitions as a politician in Washington. By 1835, we have Polk's, as far as I know, his first comment on Van Buren. Polk was giving a campaign speech in October of 35, and he was making a toast. And in one of his toasts, he mentions Martin Van Buren. And you'll notice from the quote, he calls Van Buren the magician. He doesn't call him the little magician, which was a derogatory reference to Van Buren's stature, but he calls him the magician. And then he describes Van Buren as a magician positively, not as someone who's trying to manipulate people for his own benefit, but as someone who's actually trying to work for the betterment of the United States and of its people. And so by the mid-1830s, Polk at least has a positive enough impression of Van Buren, maybe they've worked closely enough together now, that he sees him as a benefit, as he sees him as a positive. He sees him as someone who could perhaps be helpful to him in his own career down the road. Van Buren, by the time Polk gave that speech, Van Buren had been nominated by the Democrats to become the Democratic Party's presidential nominee in 36. Van Buren wins that election. He will spend 4 years in office battling all kinds of problems, which all presidents do. Van Buren, from the very start, had a difficult time. The economy went into a severe financial depression almost immediately after Van Buren took office. He had to deal with border conflicts along the Canadian border. He had to continue prosecuting the war against the Seminole Indians in Florida. And he also oversaw the removal of the Cherokee Indians in the Southeast, something that we normally attribute to Jackson. And Jackson certainly laid the foundation and put everything in place, but Van Buren is actually the person who executes their removal. So Van Buren has a very tumultuous presidency. Polk is Speaker of the House at this point, and he and Van Buren begin to correspond on a more regular basis, or at least we have that correspondence at this point. And they're probably talking in person as well. So Polk is giving Van Buren advice. For example, he tells him what he's doing about the economy is the right approach. He asks Van Buren for help with patronage appointments and other things. He also gives Van Buren advice about what to do with the Cherokee. So in this particular letter, Polk wrote to Van Buren and told him this is the best thing for the Cherokee. Both he and Van Buren agreed that the Cherokee needed to be removed for their betterment and for the betterment of the white settlers who wanted their land. He goes on to, in the letter, talk about how to approach removal in the best way, the most efficient way. He talks about the problem of Chief John Ross, the Cherokee chief, and how to handle him. So by this point, by the time Van Buren is president, Polk feels comfortable enough to give him advice And we don't have Van Buren's responses, but it seems that he and Polk were very much in sync when it came to their approaches to certain political issues. Van Buren and Polk are at least close enough that Van Buren begins to write Polk in late 1838 and early 1839 about coming to Tennessee and coming to other southern states on what was essentially a campaign tour, which was a new idea at that time. Van Buren throws out the idea of coming south and specifically to Tennessee. Polk, and Van Buren writes to Jackson as well. Polk and Jackson discuss this, and Polk writes back and he tells Van Buren, we don't think this is a good idea. And part of the reason for that is not because there was any kind of division between Polk and Van Buren at this point, but really it's because Tennessee was such a closely contested state that Polk was probably concerned that Van Buren coming to Tennessee would cause more harm than good. So I don't know if you know this about Andrew Jackson, but people either loved him or hated him. Have y'all aware of that? I mean, he was someone who was very controversial. He's a lightning rod. And in Tennessee, it's really interesting, consistently during this era of the 1830s and 40s, Tennessee votes against the Democrats and against Jackson. And that may be shocking to you if you're from Tennessee, but that is, and they're close elections, but it tells you a little bit about why Van Buren coming to Tennessee would have been problematic. With all the economic issues, all the other issues that Van Buren was facing, it was problematic for Van Buren to come to Tennessee. So I can see on my screen, okay, good. I was telling them earlier, if I had to act out my PowerPoint, we were going to be in trouble. So thankfully, that's not going to happen. So in any case, Van Buren decides to change direction. He goes to the mid-Atlantic states and then up to New England on his tour instead of coming south. But let me mention a couple of things before I move on. One of the reasons Van Buren wanted to come south is because he needed to shore up his southern base. Southern Democrats did not trust Van Buren on the issue of slavery. And as many times as he had operated and said and even done things that suggested that he would support slavery, Southern Democrats still did not trust him because he was a Northerner. So that's part of the equation of what's happening with Van Buren's interest in going south. And then Polk may not have been interested in Van Buren coming south also because he had decided to resign from Congress and to come back to Tennessee and to run for governor. And so any extra wrinkle, any added possibility of disrupting his momentum, he wanted to make sure that that was eliminated. So Polk comes back to Tennessee, runs against Newton Cannon, the Whig governor, wins that election and becomes governor. And governors in Tennessee at that time served 2-year terms. And so he was governor from 39 until at least 1841. So things are looking up for Polk, maybe not as much for Van Buren, but certainly for Polk. Van Buren enters the 1840 election year. He runs for re-election on the Democratic ticket. He is up against William Henry Harrison, whom the Whigs nominate. Harrison was a military hero from the War of 1812. He had been in Congress, had been a diplomat. The Whigs, so Harrison was a formidable opponent, but the Whigs also were starting to embrace new campaign tactics. So things like political rallies and public speeches by candidates, presidential candidates, political symbols, political songs, political cartoons. The Whigs really had galvanized their campaign for Harrison around these ideas, and the Democrats lagged behind in 1840. So Van Buren has his record he has to run on, which was not great as president. He has a candidate, an opponent, who has a military hero background that he doesn't possess. He's facing a party that is organized and that is energized and is doing new things in ways that the Democrats at the national level were not doing. And then Van Buren has another issue. And the other issue is that his vice president, Richard Johnson, was a controversial figure. And Johnson had been controversial in 36, but he and Van Buren were running essentially as a third term for Andrew Jackson. So a lot of those issues had sort of been flattened and had not been as much of an issue in 36. Now that Van Buren was running as president on his own with arguably a poor record, having Johnson as his running mate was a problem, okay? Well, why was it a problem? It was a problem because Johnson, even though he was a military hero himself, purportedly he was the man who had shot and killed Tecumseh, the great Shawnee chief who had tried to put together a pan-Indian confederacy during the War of 1812 to fight against the United States. Even though Johnson had been in Congress, even though he had been a diplomat, even though he had had a record of success, his one problem was his personal life. Johnson, who was from Kentucky, had lived openly in Kentucky with an enslaved woman by the name of Julia Chin. And not only had lived openly with her, had treated her as his wife, and they had had 2 daughters whom Johnson also had inserted into white society in Kentucky. That was problematic at that time because even though enslavers often had sex with enslaved women they owned and often produced children, to live openly and frankly brazenly as a multiracial, interracial couple was simply almost unheard of, certainly of someone of Johnson's national reputation and stature. So again, in 36, it had been a problem. In fact, Johnson had not won the majority of electoral votes to become vice president. That election had gone to the Senate to make the decision. So it had been a problem. By the time 1840 rolls around, Julia Chin had passed away. Johnson had had at least 2 more open relationships with enslaved women. In fact, there's a letter that a Democrat writes to Van Buren in which he describes a report he'd received of Johnson having a relationship with an enslaved woman who was much younger than him and almost being smitten. The description doesn't use the term smitten, but it's almost like he was smitten with her. So all of this is problematic for Van Buren and the Democrats because they're thinking, how do we dump Johnson or how do we keep him? You know, we're kind of caught in a catch-22. So ultimately, what the Democrats decide to do is they decide not to nominate anyone for the vice presidency at their convention. They let the states make that choice themselves. All right. So, well, Mark, this has been a great story, but what does any of this have to do with Polk? Well, Polk emerges during the discussions about Johnson. Polk emerges as a potential replacement for Johnson. And what's really interesting is that if you look at people like Andrew Jackson and others, they talk about Johnson's problem and they suggest a variety of different people. Polk is not the only person they talk about, but Polk's name rises to the top again and again and again. And what's really interesting is that it's during this time period when Polk takes on the nickname Young Hickory. So if you're not familiar, Andrew Jackson was known as Old Hickory. So Polk being called Young Hickory was significant. It was not just a nickname, it was an indication or a symbol that he was going to inherit the mantle of Andrew Jackson or had already inherited that mantle. So all this to say that when you have Polk's name come up as a potential replacement, there was an opportunity here for the Democrats to take a Northern Democrat, the architect of the party, and to unite him with a younger Democrat from the South, someone who was not as temperamentally the same as Jackson, but someone who ideologically was very similar to Jackson. That potentially could have been a very powerful partnership for the Democrats in 1840. Would it have made a difference? I don't know. But certainly there was an opportunity that was missed, I think, by the party at that point. In any case, it's not a close election. Van Buren loses pretty significantly to Harrison in the election. You can see Tennessee goes for the Whigs, which of course makes Andrew Jackson very angry, as many things did, if we're honest. And then the Whigs lose Harrison. He dies 1 month into office. And they're stuck with their VP choice, John Tyler, who had only been put on the Whig ticket to provide some ideological balance. Tyler was not even a genuine Whig. And that becomes pretty clear within 6 months when the Whigs essentially kick him out of the party because they're so upset that they can't control him. He's too independent-minded for them. And within a year, by the way, they begin to talk about impeaching him. So, you know, impeachment is not just a modern conception. This is something that John Tyler had to deal with. So Tyler is unpopular. The Whigs have kind of screwed up their chance, not by any part of their own, but just from, you know, an act of God, I guess. So that gives Democrats hope that in 44, if they can get things right in 44, maybe they can seize the White House back from the Whigs and take charge again, right? So in the run up to 44, you have a number of things going on. Polk runs for re-election as governor against James Chamberlain Jones from Lebanon, Lean Jimmy Jones, as he was known. It's a close election, but Polk loses. So that's not a great start for him. Van Buren, in late 1841, early 1842, begins to let his friends know that he's going to go on a trip south. He's going to go to South Carolina to visit his daughter-in-law Angelica's family. And then he's going to go over to Nashville, to the Hermitage, and see Jackson. Jackson reportedly was on his deathbed, about to pass away, and so Van Buren wanted to make sure that he saw him one last time. Spoiler alert, Jackson doesn't die until 1845, so not quite on his deathbed, although he wasn't exactly healthy. So Van Buren says, this is what I'm going to do. So he sets out, goes down the East Coast, goes to South Carolina, cuts over to Mobile, down to New Orleans, up the Mississippi, over to Nashville. He's going to spend about 6 weeks in Middle Tennessee. He'll bounce between Nashville and the Hermitage for a few weeks. He then goes down to Columbia to visit Polk, and then comes back to the Hermitage, stays with Jackson before he heads off on the rest of his trip. Now, originally, Van Buren was only going to do those two things, visit his daughter-in-law's family, and then go visit Jackson. By the time Van Buren goes to Columbia to see Polk, however, Van Buren had started to change his tune. So originally he had told people when they wrote him, no, I don't want any public dinners, don't want any public ceremonies, don't want to give any speeches. I just want to, you know, do my two things and then go back home. By the time he gets to Nashville, and certainly by the time he gets to Columbia, Van Buren's starting to change. And he's starting to act more political. He's starting to actually kind of campaign a little bit. Why that happens, we don't exactly know. We don't have any smoking gun evidence. But I think it's plausible to suggest that while he was at the Hermitage, Van Buren and Jackson talked about 44, talked about the Democratic Party's chances. When Van Buren goes down to Columbia, almost certainly, again, no evidence, but almost certainly he and Polk are talking about 44. What do you think that we can do to win? And then what's really interesting is that after Van Buren leaves the Hermitage, instead of going straight back to New York, he goes up to Kentucky. He visits Henry Clay, the Whig Party leader. He visits Richard Johnson, his former vice president. And then he goes throughout what we call the Midwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, then goes back home through the Great Lakes region. So he extends his trip by 2 months, okay? So what happened? Well, Van Buren wrote his son, Martin Jr., and told him, we've had a lot of people come out. People want to see us in all these different states, and so I think I'm obligated to go do this. In reality, I think what Van Buren had decided was he had a legitimate shot of winning the presidency in 44. And seeing the people, getting the encouragement from Jackson and Polk and the people that he saw, probably solidified the idea that he needed to start preparing for 44. Okay. Critics are talking about Van Buren's tour. They talk about how the only reason he's going to the Hermitage is basically to use Jackson again, to try kind of ride his coattails into the 44 election. There's one newspaper in Nashville that says that Van Buren went to Columbia specifically to put together a bargain presumably for 1844, where Van Buren would run as president, Polk would run as vice president. Polk denies that. He said that they did not discuss the 1844 election. Jackson, by the way, doesn't say anything about what he and Van Buren talked about, and Van Buren doesn't really talk about it either. So a lot of the things I'm saying are suggestive, but I think they're plausible explanations for what's going on. In any case, Van Buren eventually makes it back home and starts preparing for the 44 election. Polk, in the meantime, runs for governor again against Lean Jimmy Jones, and he loses again. So Polk, whose trajectory had been like this, politically, Speaker of the House, governor, talked about for the VP nomination in 40, all of a sudden his career seems to be in a little bit of a tailspin. But both of his losses to Lean Jimmy Jones were very close elections. And so Polk is not quite as dissatisfied or depressed about his prospects as some people. And his friends and allies are not either, because they see him as someone who's running a very close race in a very hotly contested state, who has had national success. So they don't really see his prospects for the future dimming when it comes to national elections like the vice presidency. As we go into 1844, the landscape politically for the campaign appeared to be the same old issues, economic issues primarily, particularly if Van Buren was the Democratic nominee. So things like tariffs, for example, banking, public lands, revenue, government revenue, how it would be distributed. That seems to be the ground that most people are thinking the campaign was going to be fought on. However, things change in early 44, and a new issue begins to emerge and will become really the leading issue of 44, and that's the issue of Texas annexation. Texas had gained its independence during a revolution against Mexico in the mid-1830s, had become an independent republic, had asked the United States to be annexed, to be brought into the Union. Both Andrew Jackson and Van Buren had said no as president. By 1843, late 1843, early 1844, however, there were blueprints being laid or put together that would allow Texas to come into the Union and become at least one new state, if not multiple new states. So because Texas was becoming such a hot issue, people are interested in the frontrunners. You know, what do the presidential frontrunners think about this? And so there's a Mississippi congressman by the name of William Hammett who writes Van Buren a letter and asks him, what's your opinion about the immediate annexation of Texas? And Van Buren, as he often did, wrote back at length, and this letter was published in newspapers. And essentially what Van Buren said was, I do not support the immediate annexation of Texas. And he gives the reasons why. This becomes a problem for Van Buren, and frankly, it becomes the fatal problem for Van Buren, because Southern Democrats, many of them don't trust Van Buren. Remember I said that earlier. So now when he is saying he's against the annexation of Texas, these Southern Democrats who viewed Texas as a new opportunity for the expansion of slavery, all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute. We've had our suspicions about Van Buren, but he's essentially saying that he's not going to support our vision. Even though, by the way, Van Buren doesn't say anything about slavery in the letter. He doesn't say anything about slavery in the letter. That is how Southern Democrats are interpreting it. So this really becomes the weapon that they use against Van Buren when it comes to trying to sink his nomination in 1844. When news of Van Buren's letter reaches Nashville, Andrew Jackson is perplexed. He's angry, again, common theme. He summons James K. Polk to the Hermitage and has a discussion with him. And essentially what he tells Polk and a couple of other men who are there is that when the Democrats go for their national convention in May in Baltimore, they need to choose a pro-annexation candidate, which immediately eliminates Van Buren. You can surmise that during that discussion, Jackson is saying to Polk, you might be the guy, right? At the very least, I believe, Jackson is telling Polk, you need to be the VP candidate. So at the very least, we have someone sitting in that second spot who is pro-annexation. But Jackson does not want Van Buren in that spot at this point. So as the Democrats move to Baltimore to begin to select their presidential and vice presidential nominees, you have a sense of growing momentum against Van Buren, and that certainly plays out at the convention. At the Democratic National Convention, you have 3 Tennessee delegates who essentially serve as Polk's advocates in getting him the nomination. Cave Johnson, who serves throughout this time as a de facto campaign manager for Polk. Gideon Pillow, who takes all the credit for any success Polk ever had, as he was wont to do. If you know anything about Gideon Pillow, his ego was larger than Napoleon's. It's interesting because outside observers who were there kind of downplay how much influence Pillow had, but Pillow didn't believe that. And then you have on the far right, Andrew Jackson Donaldson, who was Andrew Jackson's nephew, who had been at the meeting that Jackson had with Polk at the Hermitage, in which he said, we need a pro-annexation candidate. So these 3 men are critical to getting Polk nominated as president at the Democratic Convention. The first 7 ballots show Van Buren in the lead, but he cannot muster enough votes to win the nomination. He begins to bleed votes very quickly. And so on the 8th ballot, Polk's name appears first for the first time. And then by the 9th ballot, he is unanimously nominated for the presidency on the Democratic ticket. So fortunes changed very quickly. You have Van Buren, who for a number of years, at least a couple of years, had been the front runner. All of a sudden, Polk kind of emerges from what many people believed was a downward spiral politically to become the Democratic nominee. So the tickets, the 2 main tickets, and there are other candidates who run, and I'm not going to mention them for the sake of time, but the 2 main tickets, you have the Democrats with Polk and George Dallas from Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a key economic state for the Democrats, running against Henry Clay and Theodore Frelinghuysen on the Whig ticket. And it's kind of funny. Clay was the natural nominee for the Whigs, but one of his issues was he had a reputation for being a womanizer and a gambler and a drunkard. And so the Whigs chose him, but then they put with him Theodore Frelinghuysen, who was as straight arrow and moral a guy as you could find. So he was kind of the Mike Pence of that ticket, I guess, is the way to look at him. So you have the Democrats versus the Whigs, and again, there's some other candidates, minor candidates who are running as well. Van Buren is understandably not happy about losing the nomination to Polk, but he actually writes a draft of a letter in which he said he knew that this might happen. He knew that his letter to Hammett might cost him the nomination, and he was okay with that because he stood on principle. So, and that's right after the convention takes place. So early on, Van Buren seemed okay with how things went. During the campaign, he gives his support to Polk and Dallas as a ticket. But what's really interesting is that Polk and Van Buren do not correspond between the convention and the election. And I've always found that to be very interesting because you would think that these are 2 men who had been closely connected through Jackson, who had worked for the same purposes ideologically, who had had a good relationship in the past. There's an iciness there. There's an iciness there where Polk is not consulting with Van Buren and Van Buren is not offering his advice. Okay? So keep that in mind. Polk wins the election. It's a very close election electorally and in terms of popular vote. There are several states that are decided by very slim margins. You will notice that Tennessee once again goes Whig, but only by about 120 votes. So it's an extremely close election in Tennessee. Louisiana, Georgia, other states, again, you're talking about 1,000 or so votes separating the 2 candidates. New York, where Van Buren was from, separated by 5,000 votes. goes for Polk. And that makes a difference and makes the difference if you look at the numbers. So if you're looking at things from Van Buren's perspective, he lost the nomination, he supported the ticket, and he helped to carry New York for Polk. Okay? And so that, I think that helps explain the mindset of what happens next. And we're going to end with this segment. So Polk, after the election's over, Polk does write to Van Buren finally and asked him for his advice on cabinet appointments. You know, who should be my advisory council? Who should be the people I surround myself with? And Van Buren has thoughts. And he gives thoughts about all cabinet officers, but he gives specific thoughts about two positions, the two most important, Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury. So for Secretary of State, Van Buren recommends Silas Wright Jr. and Benjamin Franklin Butler, both of whom were old friends. Silas Wright, in fact, Van Buren had told friends going to Baltimore for the nominations that if Van Buren looked like he was going to lose, that they needed to nominate Silas Wright. Butler had been Van Buren's law partner early on. They had had a very long, very close relationship. So Van Buren wants one of these two in that position. For Treasury, again, you have Silas Wright there as an option according to Van Buren, and then two of his other old friends, Azariah Flagg and Churchill Chamberlain. What Van Buren wanted was he wanted New York rewarded for giving the election to Polk. That's what he wanted. He wanted recognition that his loss and his loyalty to the party had helped Polk win. And he wanted New York to be rewarded for that. Polk does not see it in the same light. Polk is concerned that Van Buren is trying to insert people into his cabinet who are going to try to control him. And so Polk goes in a different direction. He goes with a New Yorker, William Marcy, someone who used to be good friends with Van Buren, but they had started to split at this point, and eventually will split. And he's only appointed Secretary of War, which was a lower ranked position when it came to patronage appointments and other things like that. So New York gets something, but it's not what Van Buren recommended, and it's certainly not what he wanted. Van Buren's reaction is really interesting because he starts complaining. And his argument was that Polk had asked him for advice, he gave Polk his advice, and then Polk ignored it. And Polk kind of set a trap because the last correspondence they had, by the time Van Buren got the letter and was able to respond, Polk had already made up his mind. And so Van Buren felt slighted. He felt like Polk asked my opinion, and then he went ahead and made his decision without giving me time to respond. And so he felt disrespected from that. From Polk's perspective, a couple of years into his presidency, he writes in his diary about this episode, and he says essentially he thought Van Buren was trying to control his presidency, and he wasn't going to allow that to happen. Except for a couple of messages that Polk forwarded to Van Buren during his presidency and Van Buren's perfunctory replies, the two men never correspond again after the cabinet discussion. So during the campaign, they do not correspond. They correspond between November of 44, March of 45, and then after that, you have only a couple of perfunctory letters between the two. Polk, of course, dies in 49. Van Buren goes on and serves as the Democratic Party's elder statesman until he dies in 1862. So what's the point of all this? The point is that when you look at the Democratic Party, which does hold together until 1860, despite some of the sectional divisions that they had, it really could have been strengthened with a more national focus than it had if Van Buren and Polk had found a way to come together in 44. And it's not entirely their fault that they didn't. There were other circumstances and other people involved. But there were opportunities there. There were opportunities in 1840 for the Democratic Party to form more of a vision of what Van Buren had foreseen in 1827. but it doesn't happen. And it doesn't happen in part because Van Buren and his approach to his iciness toward Polk during the campaign. And it doesn't happen in part because of Polk's stubbornness and his belief that Van Buren is trying to manipulate him, hearkening back to those old nicknames like the Little Magician and the Sly Fox of Kinderhook. So I'm going to stop there. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer those for however much time we have allotted. I think Gordon has a microphone that he'll bring to you if you have a question.
Great talk, Mark. Thanks. How do you, how confident are you that you have the Van Buren correspondence completely, or could there be letters out there that you haven't seen?
Good question. So if you don't know, the Polk papers are finished. They're complete. They finished in 2019, 2020. Our project is still ongoing, but I'm never 100% sure, but 99.9% sure. And I should mention that I had an intern, Zach Kinslow, who's now director at the Clement Railroad Hotel Museum, who did the research originally for this, and then I came back behind him and made sure that we had all the correspondence. He did the heavy work of transcribing them, which I'm very grateful for. But we're confident that we have what we know exists. You know, if you know of any hidden letters, please let me know, because I would be happy to see those, but pretty confident. Other questions?
You talked about the narrow margin of victory in the state of Tennessee by, I think, 120 votes. What was the total vote count? What percentage of that, roughly, right, would that have been in Tennessee at that time?
I'd have to go back and look at the numbers to know exactly the percentages. But it was again, 120 votes, very slim margin.
Very slim margin, even that. Yeah. Thank you.
Yep. It's in my book. So I can either hurry over there and look at it, or you can look at it later. Good question. Somebody else over here had a question. Hey, Alex.
Kind of consistent tumultuum amongst the Democratic Party at this time. What was the other party, the Whig party's kind of perception of everything going on with Polk and Van Buren and this turmoil that was arising?
Good question. So I think some of the Whigs were probably disappointed that Van Buren wasn't the candidate because he was a known quantity. So he had a record as president. And when you have a record as president and you're running for re-election, people can look to that and they can point to, well, you want to be in the White House again. Here's what you did the first time, right? So how are you going to be better at this? You know, what have you done differently? So when there's a little bit of a curveball and all of a sudden you have Polk who becomes the candidate, you have Whigs trying to scramble to figure out, okay, how do we attack this guy? And they find ways. They talk about his slaveholding. They talk about the fact that he's so closely associated with Jackson. So if he's young Hickory, Jackson's old Hickory, you know, we can kind of attack him in the same ways without worrying about the temper. So they have to adjust to that. But part of the problem the Whigs have is that their candidate, Henry Clay, and this is purely by coincidence, on the very same day that Van Buren's letter against annexation was published, Clay had also published a letter against annexation. Again, there's no conspiracy there. It was just simply coincidence. So when Polk gets the nomination and he's adamantly pro-annexation, Henry Clay has to start backtracking. And he publishes several letters, a total of 4 letters, in which he essentially cedes ground each time toward annexation. So that curveball, I think, probably hurt the Whigs in some ways because Clay is having to adjust his campaign in ways he didn't anticipate. But at the same time, the fact that Polk is so adamantly pro-annexation gives the Whigs something to plant a flag on, that we're going to be against annexation, Polk is for it. So that is a clear definer, if that makes sense. And again, there are other issues, immigration and other things that they talk about, but Texas is really the main issue throughout most of the country that the decision probably turns on for most people. Other question?
slavery. The dominance of the slavery for one party to another or north to south, was it that impregnated in voting?
That's a good question. So I think for a number of decades after the Civil War, Americans and even scholars kind of downplayed the role of slavery as an important part of this era of politics. So in the decade prior to the Civil War, certainly you would discuss it and maybe give different weight to it. But during this era, I think a lot of people didn't see it as a critical issue. But within the past 40 to 50 years, scholars have honed in and done the research on how much slavery affected politics in this era. And it's very significant. I mean, slavery is interwoven throughout every political campaign from at least 1828 through 1861. So it's very much a part of the equation. Now, for individual voters, who knows? Are they making the decision because their family was Democratic and so they're going to vote Democratic? Are they making the decision because of an immediate issue that faces them in their area, their town, their state, their region? Or are they looking at the bigger picture? It's hard to know. We don't have polling. We don't have ways other than going and reading letters and newspaper articles to try to figure out what people were thinking, but then you extrapolate that to everyone, it's very difficult. But the fact that slavery is so critical to the United States economy, it's the engine that's driving the United States economy, I think of necessity makes it a critical issue, whether people are making their individual decisions based on that or not. It's certainly shaping the campaign and the rhetoric. Other questions?
I was interested if you addressed the media's role in the reporting and trying to flip an election one direction or the other.
Sure, absolutely. One of the things that my research agenda has done over the past few years is started to focus, I still focus on what we would call high politics, where you're talking about politicians and their perspective. I've started to focus more on what's happening outside of that circle, not that newspapers are completely outside that circle, but looking at what's being given to voters, to your point, what's being given to voters as the main issues. And one of the things I think that we today don't often recognize about the media at that time, number one, it's newspapers. Number two, newspapers were openly partisan. They were controlled and owned by a political party. So there was no attempt at transparency. Even today, at least we have the veneer, right? We can argue about whether, how transparent people are or how polarized or partisan they are, but at least there's a veneer of transparency in most cases today. At that time, there was not. So you have political newspapers and these editors who are making arguments based on what they want voters to do. And they lie, hard to believe, the media lied. They created hoaxes and spread hoaxes, and it was really kind of a dirty game of politics because they were trying to get voters engaged. And something I didn't mention in my talk, but something you need to be aware of, is that the 1840 election had seen over 80% of eligible voters participate. 80%. In 44, that drops down a little bit. But consistently between 1840 and the early 1900s, you have 70 to 80% of voters, eligible voters, participating, right? That's incredible. Why are they participating? For a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is because of media. So it's really interesting, and you can't make apple to apple comparisons to today, but it's really interesting how at that time media really drove in many ways voting, getting voters out. And today it seems almost as if sometimes media keeps voters from being interested because we're overwhelmed with so much of what comes out of the media. Other questions? I know we're kind of up against time, but if anybody has a last question, I'd be happy to take it. Well, I appreciate your time. I do have some books for sale if you're interested. I'll be happy to talk to you. Just get past that. I'll be happy to talk to you about anything I mentioned. If you want to buy a book, that's fine. If you don't and just want to come talk to me, that'd be great too. But thank you for your time and attention. I really appreciate you coming out.